My name is Anna Plummer. I am Program Coordinator at the Emily Dickinson Museum, and welcome to the August edition of our 2023 Phosphorescence Poetry Series. Dickinson used the term phosphorescence to describe a divine spark, the illuminating light of creative expression. The museum launched this series during the pandemic in celebration of the power of poetry to spark the imagination and even ignite transformation. We are thrilled to return with another series this year, running monthly now through October, bringing you established and emerging poets from all over the world. And before I introduce tonight's wonderful lineup, I have two pieces of information for you, our audience. So since we couldn't fit you today in the Dickinson family parlor, we encourage you to use the chat feature in your Zoom app to share affirmations and words of encouragement for our poets tonight. These comments form a kind of record for our time together here, so we love to share this with our poets afterwards. Tonight's reading will also be followed by a Q&A, and I will be looking for your questions in the chat, and the Q&A feature is also at the bottom of your toolbar, so please do select that and type in your questions for the poets here. You can do that at any point throughout the program. And now I am so glad to introduce tonight's poets who are joining me here in Emily Dickinson's parlor in Amherst, Massachusetts. So we'll start with Devanshi. Khetarpal is the editor-in-chief and founder of Inklet magazine, and she is an incoming MFA candidate in fiction at the Iowa Writers Workshop and holds a master's in comparative literature at New York University. Her work has been published or is forthcoming in Public Books, Liber, A Feminist Review, Diacritics Blog, Poetry at Sangam, and the Bombay Literary Magazine. Her poetry collection, Small Talk, came out in 2019 from Writers Workshop India, Kolkata. Devanshi has received support from Yale Writers Workshop, Red Loaf Translators Conference, and the Juniper Writing Institute here at UMass Amherst. And her work was longlisted for the 2023 Toto Award for Creative Writing in English. She is from Bhopal, India, and currently lives in Iowa. And the link to her website will also be shared in the chat. Next, we will have Yamini Pathak, who is the author of the chapbooks Atlas of Lost Places and Breathfire Water Song. Her words are forthcoming or have appeared in Poetry Northwest, About Place Journal, Tupelo Quarterly, Vita Review, and Waxwing. She is a poet in schools for the Geraldine Dodge Foundation, serves as poetry editor for Inch Micro Chapbooks with Bull City Press, and is a production assistant for Tupelo Quarterly Journal. And Yamini holds an MFA in poetry from Antioch University, LA, and has received support from Vona Voices and Community Writers. And it brings her joy to belong to the Dunia Collective, which is an interdisciplinary group of BIPOC artists. Born in India, she lives with her family in New Jersey. And last but not least, we will hear from Ilan Stavans, who is Lewis Sebring Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College, publisher of Restless Books, and a consultant to the Oxford English Dictionary. He is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, and his work has been adapted into film, theater, TV, and radio, and has been translated into 24 languages. And I recommend that you find out more about Ilan's work by heading to the Restless Books website, which we will also share with you in the chat. So without further ado, let's begin with Devanshi. Feel free to take the podium.
Thank you so much for having us here and for joining in. Since we're at the Emily Dickinson Museum, I was thinking a lot about versions of poems and word choices and switching around words. So I'm going to read two versions of a poem, or maybe they're two different poems. You'll judge. This is titled Shelter Island. Do not look at this room inside my body. No. Arrive as if you are overcome, not by feeling or disease, but by the seamlessness of pure syntax to speak nothing of the waves that butcher us here in slow degrees. When the water is cold, I step foot on the sharpest of stones, as if they are all small women assembled to breathe. And then the next version is titled Night Shift. Do not look at the animal inside my body. No. Enter as if you are consumed, not by this light, but by the disaster happening. Speak of when we were friends, when you said to the woman, please eat, and I became smaller, unable to assemble inside me. This next poem was something that I was actually working on at Amherst in the summer of the Juniper Writing Institute. It's a poem called Regime. This is a private country. They say it is for small men who stand cleanly like a colony of teeth between the stones. I heard them once, hissing, each word a cold half-syllable. I keep them to myself. Breath makes the mouth a vessel. I sleep in the shape of a poem and wake in the outline of a country that was once here. I remember its limits. This is a poem that I wrote that was sort of inspired by Emily Dickinson's use of the em dash, but I was sort of working with different punctuations, so I think you can interpret the pauses as sort of slashes on a page, maybe. This poem is titled Kissa, which means fable. Listen. A girl's head hangs from a tree, and all night her lips hinge their lightless words upon its leaves. Think of her body and a bird inside it, bone perched on thinner bone. Songs snowed across her veins, begging to lean along the sky, break its beakless mouth to song. The next poem is inspired by my mother, who's a forensic pathologist and took me to see an autopsy when I was in middle school. It took me 10 years to understand what that sentence really means. And so I wrote a poem about it 10 years later called Postmortem. But yes, so I don't know what this says about me and my mother, but yeah. Postmortem. Listen. Imagine your body next to mine. Think of the knife that drew my thin spine open. I am in a room so cold and lonely, like the slow negative of a stone breaking into water. One evening, I asked you how to die, this slow, smooth, bent along the edges of my grave, almost losing my way back home. I sort of wrote a series of poems for poetry at Sangam. which were kind of generated from the pandemic or my time during the pandemic. It was also a time I was in and out of hospitals a lot for various reasons. So these are poems inspired by that. The first one is titled, If You Should Have to Ask. I want to lose something. The stones take turns inside my mother's tired body. I am the ugliest woman in the waiting room. Anything that comes with instructions ends up somewhere dead inside me. The next one is titled The Hottest August, which is also inspired by a documentary of the same name. And in the documentary, the filmmaker asked everyone a question, what are your fears for the future? And it wasn't supposed to be a documentary about the climate crisis, but everyone mentioned the climate crisis or hinted towards it. So I wrote a poem titled The Hottest August. In a dream, my father was alive elsewhere with another woman and son. It was late in August. On the train station, I felt another body grow inside me. I waited, wanted. Then the other night, a friend killed herself standing on the edge of that platform. Her face, a catalog of barely beautiful things, a landscape in the present perfect tense. And this other poem is titled Overheard. My friend claims she was born with a hole in her heart, a vulgarly plain metaphor, close enough to the sound of her name, and everything it fails to hold. This is another series of 2 short poems from the hospital series, I like to call it. This one is titled Mammography. My house ages like a breast, sagging long behind these windowless walls. Asking for the doctor. I want all this grief removed from my body, like a floret of pencil shavings, crackling like autumn leaves when touched. And I think I'm going to do this poem that I wrote for, again, my mother, which is titled Sandalwood, because she said it's 3:30 a.m. in India, and she said to tune in. So I was like, okay, I need to do something, so I'm making her wake up. So this one is titled Sandalwood. In my mother's room, there is a kind of light I cannot drape. In the sandalwood closet, her wedding sari hangs with the ripple of temple bells ringing. Here is the Hindi I don't speak. It is the color of my mother on her wedding day, Ma, 27, tucking in this continent of herself, so close to the light. What moon shone that day? Answer, in other words. This poem is titled Apology. All day the winter light lies on my back like a stranger, coming to your door, asking for apology. Now that I think about it, I actually write a lot of poems about winter, but not enough about other seasons. So I think I'm going to do maybe a weather-neutral poem, which is titled Trattino, which means a dash in Italian. I found inside myself the mouth of a lake where the village brings its dying. Hanging from a tree, I ask the birds about their songs, settling softly by the cold stones. But then the stones are always cold in my poems, so I don't know what to do about that. I should write some summer poems next. But speaking of birds, there's a poem called Water Birds, which I wrote after attending a concert by Zakir Hussain, who plays the tabla. And it was after that concert that I immediately just wrote this down in my notebook. This is titled Water Birds. The sound of the tabla crackles on the ears, like 1,000 little water birds, leaping stone to stone. And then I'm going to end with another poem that mentions a bird, and it's called An Aperture. Where blue and empty you stand feeling your bones for water, there is a bird sinking. The river picks it up as a ritual meant to be forgotten. See, the light breaks its feathers for you to see me alive and opening. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone. Devanshi, I'm still in the world of your poems. I want to say a big thank you to Anna and Brooke and the Emily Dickinson Museum team for just making this possible, and thank you to everyone who's logged in to listen. Most of the poems I'm going to read today are from a manuscript that I'm working on. And I feel like Emily Dickinson might appreciate these first couple of poems, which are about being silent in the world and turning to one's interior life. What a good girl, said everyone, while I filled my larynx with butterflies and sucked my thumb to hold them there. The fan of wings beating in the space between two words. Alone then, leaning into the desert, I learned the color of thirst, the lurching gait of camels, the crunch between teeth in the aftermath of a sandstorm. Pursued peacocks with their bottom-heavy strut, dragging emeralds in the dust. How lucid the studded throat of night, innocent of city lights. Unspoken. Imagine the room of an empty throat. Imagine a voice that wanders homeless. Biology class, a cockroach spread-eagled, pinned, veined inner wings exposed. Students gawk, one throws up. The cockroach is dead and doesn't care for your empathy. A body without cognition of platonic touch, when every brush means danger or every contact bland as milk. A visit to market with mother, choosing a chicken. In one swift stroke, a bird is beheaded, tossed into a tall bin, its dying throes, the thumbs against thin aluminum walls. Whose frantic heart is that? I grew up in India and came to the United States as an adult, and so I carry many things from my homeland with me, and they tend to show up in my poems. This next poem is a list poem, and it is called Red Things. A chat on a moonlit terrace where one person is more in love than the other. Both laugh, each sounds different. Boatmen struggling in the biceps of a river. Some memories are redder than others. I watched my brother beat another boy on the playground because he called our father a bastard. Saw the boy's body crumple like a paper flower. His nose spurt crimson blooms. Nobody knew what a bastard was. Labor pains. The scent of street food wafting up from the vendor's cart as he puts together a paper cone of puffed rice, slivers of onion, cucumber, tomato, and hot green chilies, lemon juice, and mustard oil. The tide of saliva that rises in the mouth. This is not a red memory. It's definitely green, lime green, raw mango green. Ribbons in shiny black hair, swinging braids. A man who carried newspapers, magazines, bestsellers, and comic books wrapped in a white sheet. A door-to-door visiting library. He smelled of paper and ink. The rush of blood to my face when I opened the door. Train journeys. Hot wind, paddy fields, egret, and buffalo. Towns with names like Itarsi and Manma Junction, where you will never get off, but whose names you murmur in time with the rhythm of the rails. Scalding hot chai numbs your tongue. Coal dust from the steam engine blows back in the wind. Take care it doesn't get in your eyes. Some of it is still on fire. And this poem is called Mirch Masala, which translates to hot spice. And it's a longish poem in 6 sections. 1. Flavor, heat, color. 3 doors into satiety, I know. My mother carried bags of wheat berries, whole red chilies, coriander seeds, turmeric root to the miller. In the mill, air was dim, suspended with escape particles. Strange and raw, we breathed in those floating free radicals that insinuated themselves into every crook and cranny, line the contours of our ears, our nails. We waited for the things we wanted. Waiting spiced the imagination and tripped us over the threshold between doing and being. When our bags returned, they were hot from friction, heavy with scent. 2. A cookbook from the court of Jahangir, the 17th century Mughal emperor, reveals the same spices and foods I use in my kitchen. Except they used enormous clay ovens to bake pilafs, char tomatoes, and other meats under live coals. Jahangir's father, the Emperor Humayun, smashed thousands of bottles of liquor with his own hands before his army on the eve of a losing battle, vowing not to drink until the enemy was vanquished. The drama, the victory, the defeat, humming by my electric stove. 3. On the eve of my wedding, my mother gave me a spice box she had carried overseas all the way from India. Much like hers in stainless steel, 6 small cylinders redolent with the colors and smells of home. My name engraved in slanted letters on the lid. I felt so grown up then. Every day since I've used it. I've had 22 years to grow up. 4. The spice box glares, red, yellow, and seedy brown eyes. Do I know what it takes to nourish a family? I resent the time it takes to cook from scratch. I dislike grocery shopping. In India, this makes me a mother who doesn't care to feed her kids. Salt twinkles coarse comfort in Mary Oliver's voice. You do not have to be good. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it does. 5. Indian weddings have a turmeric ceremony known as the haldi. Bride and groom separately are adorned by their entourage with a mask of turmeric mixed with fresh cream. Haldi, the healer, the beautifier. Part blessing, part joyful teasing. Every member of the wedding party is invited to smear the bride and groom's face and arms until it all dissolves into a noisy yellow mud bath. From this, the couple is unpeeled, unpetaled, glowing from the attention of so many hands. 6. Spice to startle our lips, trouble our tongues, spill and stain our mothers' nails, know our mothers by their hands. So this summer I'm faced with a different sort of leaving. My oldest child will leave for college for the very first time. So I have a poem here, it's called Leaving. And it includes a fragment from another powerful woman poet, Sappho. Leaving. But a kind of yearning has hold of me this summer. I don't want the bees to die. A net pulled taut across the deck, we play into the long evenings. Once his racket smacked into a bumblebee. Its fat, furred torso lay wounded among the planks, wing broken. My boy told me to put it out of its misery, but I lacked courage, was unable to take a life, especially one used to shelter in the hearts of flowers. I dreamed my children into being, years ago, a shining peace on the dewy lotus banks of Kerala. A blue boat, we crouched under cover, the heat gathered, sullen in pleats of sky, drawstrings pulling ever tighter. My firstborn, birthed not to ride the river of woe, not to drink the waters of Acheron. He won't, until the turning of summer's gold, leave. So I've read Emily Dickinson had eye problems, and I do as well. So this final poem is one that offers some love to the troubled eye. It's called Ode to My Right Eye That Sees Double After Reading Late. Girl, you're soldier and queen, one of two sultanas dreaming in their harem, walled behind glass, unveiled only to the favored. Heavy-lidded droop, tender in your bath of rose water and sliced cucumbers, cooling the fern blue shadows you cast. Once you were imprisoned for laziness all summer behind a pirate patch, made me the one-eyed oddity in the neighborhood, found wanting, under pressure of the black ants that crawled across the fourth row of the eye chart. I know that ache. It comes from carrying blame unearned, the girl who wears glasses. Remember the time somebody's mother waved a wand of mascara for a school concert and called you gorgeous? I was shaken down to my skinned knees. Nobody had ever called any part of me beautiful. And that time, when a piece of you stuck to a contact lens and tore. Scarred, you tilt towards the dark, the fuzzy logic of traffic lights and memorized street signs. In the mirror, a forest of names you've called me, none of them song. But that is history. Everything you touch is mine, all the light you hold, all your shine. Thank you.
I'm both lucky and pride myself in being a neighbor of Emily Dickinson. I have lived in this town, Amherst, for 30 years. And I do so, I remind myself every day, because she lived here. It is sacred ground, this very building, the Homestead, and this very town, the heart of New England, and the heart of the English language, and of American English in particular. To me, reading Emily Dickinson is arriving to the English language. I was born into Spanish, into Yiddish, and English was a distant northern language, very foreign, inscrutable, and deciphering it was trying to figure out what the music of the language is. And I can't speak of a higher toned, more melodic and rhythmic musician than Emily Dickinson. Whenever I come to the Homestead, I think of the books that she had, the family had in their library, and particularly of the dictionaries. It seems to me that in the Noah Webster dictionary that was already in circulation at that time, all her poems yet to be written are already alive. She simply needed to sort them out, to catch the words, and to stamp them on the page in her own memorable, immortal way. I have done translations throughout my life because I was born into two languages and because I was an outsider of the English language. And I have translated her into Spanish, but I am going to do something slightly different today. I am going to translate her, or I'm going to read the translations that I've done of her into Spanglish, which is a hybrid, jazzy language spoken by millions of people, predominantly in the United States. It is not English, it is not Spanish, it's Spanglish. It's the marriage and the divorce of those two languages. I have 5 poems by her and 5 versions of them in Spanglish, and then a little gift. I will read them first in English, in homage to her, and then the version in Spanish. You will recognize them. They are celebrated poems. I can't think of the English language without them. And of course I can't think of them without the English language. I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they'll advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog. To tell one's name, the livelong June, to an admiring bug. Soy nobody. ¿Quién eres tú? ¿Eres nobody tú? Then somos pareja, silencio, lo anunciarán, you know. Cuán dreary ser somebody, cuán public como un frog. Decir un nombre, el siempre June, al impresionable bug. The gleam of a heroic act, such strange illumination, the possible slow fuse is lit by the imagination. Resplandor de un acto heroico, qué extraña illumination. Lento fusible de lo posible, enciende el imagination. I sent 2 sunsets, day and I, in competition ran. I finished 2, and several stars, while he was making 1. His own was ampler, but as I was saying to a friend, mine is the more convenient to carry in the hand. 2 puertas al sol mandé, Day y yo, que componiendo huyen. 2 terminé y varias stars, mientras hacia él bullen. La suya es sampler, pero como le dije a un amigo, las mías son mejores para llegar conmigo. Faith is a fine invention for gentlemen to see, but microscopes are prudent in an emergency. Fe es una fine invention para gentlemen con agencia, but microscopios son prudentes en una emergencia. I dwell on possibility, a fairer house than prose, more numerous than windows, superior for doors, of chambers as the caters, impregnable of eye, and for an everlasting roof, the gambrels of the sky. Of visitors the fairest, for occupation this, the spreading wide my narrow hands to gather paradise. Yo duelo en possibility y fairer casa que prosa. Más numerosas las ventanas, por las puertas osan. Como satyrs de recámaras, impregnables al ojo, y por un everlasting lecho, los gambreles en rojo. De visitas, las muy fairest, estas por ocupación, el spreading de mi narrow mano, para gatear lo humano. And then here's a little gift. The two souls of this town, the chroniclers and the witnesses, are of course Emily Dickinson and the other great poet who lived here, Robert Frost. And I also spend my days at the Robert Frost Library teaching Robert Frost poetry to younger generations. I, who was exiled or left out of the English language and who moved my way into it, to native English speakers. There's something embarrassing about it. This is a poem that Robert Frost had to read at the John F. Kennedy inauguration because he just couldn't find the one that he had written for that day. It is called The Road Not Taken. And as in the previous cases, mine is, it will be followed by a translation into Spanglish. And I'd like to conclude by saying that translation to me is as creative and wholesome an effort as poetry or writing itself. It involves equal effort and ingenuity. But translation is also something else. Translation is a way to appropriate a poem and give it to your own people. And I have translated this Robert Frost poem and Emily Dickinson's poems into Spanglish because the population of 65 million Latinos in the United States deserves to have our own Emily Dickinson versions and our own Robert Frost versions, the way we should also have other classics. Every civilization, every culture needs to have through translation their own version of the classics. The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler. Long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the very claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, through us for that passing there, had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads unto way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. El camino not tomado. Two caminos divergen en un yellow bosque, y sorry que no pude travelear los dos, y ser un solo traveler. Long estuve y looked uno para abajo as far as que pude, a donde se ventea el undergrowth. Then tomé el otro, tan justo y fair, y having quizá la better clama, porque estaba grassy y necesitaba wear, salvo que por el passing there really casi igual los había horneado. Y both esa mañana, equally la hallaba, en hojas ningún paso had trodden para atrás, o me quedé con el first por another día, yet sabiendo cómo un güey lidea a otro güey, dudé si yo jamás regresaría. Debería decir esto con un side, somewhere, pa'lante siglos y siglos. Dos caminos divergen en un bosque y yo tomé el less traveleado y eso has made all la diferencia.
Well, thank you three so much for just your wordsmithing and your lives shared in this space. It really feels right. This is the first time you're all three meeting each other, and I have some questions of my own, and I'll just encourage audience members to put those in the question and answer section if you have them. But I wanted to kind of give you some space first, since this is the first time as people and as poets that you're knowing each other this evening. So what's resonating with you from something your fellow poet read right now?
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to hear your translations into Spanglish and also to hear your reasons for translation, which is wonderful. I too am like very interested in translation, and I guess what struck me is like my reasons for going into translation are so different from yours, but I really applaud your reasons. Mine were to get closer to Indian literature, and this is one way that I see, to really close read Indian literature. But I think it was beautiful that you're bringing Spanish to the people who are like day-to-day, I'm sorry, not bringing Spanish, but bringing Emily Dickinson and all of these poets to people living in the United States who are speaking Spanglish, and just modernizing the whole thing.
And I was struck really deeply by the way you use very dreamlike, sometimes surrealistic image to connect your body, your mother, illness, and to what felt to me kind of to fracture the reality that we live and to rearrange it in images that are very powerful. In brief, very Emily Dickinson-like poems that feel like fresh air.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, it was a breath of fresh air to listen to your translations too, and it's always interesting to hear poems from a translator's perspective, or to hear translated versions of poems, and then I think even your poems, Yamini, because it was sort of, I think with both of your works, you were both coming from elsewhere to arrive at a point in your poems, to arrive to language or to a different space or to a different land or a country, and different metaphors even, and so I loved the way, Yamini, that you were listing things as they are, and it sounded so nice. And I was thinking of the arrangement on the page of those, And yeah, that was really fascinating to me. This arrival from elsewhere to language.
I have been in the last few years, exploring the limits of the ode and what odes do in different languages and the poets in those languages, the English language, the French, Spanish. And in Spanish, one of the greatest ode makers is Pablo Neruda, who wrote 225 odes to the most mundane of objects, like shoelaces and salt and French fries and a movie theater and shells on the ocean. And that beautiful ode that you read felt very much in dialogue with Neruda. The way you played with the U and the I, and it is in Neruda, he is thanking those objects for existing. Thank you, French fries. I need you. Thank you, shoelaces. Who would I be without you? And the ode that you read felt very essential. Like you were thanking an aspect of life. It was beautiful.
Thank you. I'm not familiar with Neruda's odes, so now I
Good.
need to go look them up.
Something I noticed in your poems, Yamini, was kind of an expansion of our idea. Obviously, you all have some experience with translation in common, but there's also, of course, translation in different modes, translation between subcultures, or translation even from written word to spoken word. And you were also making a translation, I think, between time, talking about history in your present day experience of cooking.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you all see translation in a broader way as you're working, since you have that experience. What have you learned by translating as you write poems, maybe that you're not translating?
In my case, and for me, translation is a way to create another original. It's not I don't want it to be the shadow of the one that I am translating, but I want it to have its own music and its own authenticity, even if it has to falsify certain aspects of the original in order to bring something new. I think that Emily Dickinson is one of the hardest poets to translate because of the just purity of her words. They are just so crystalline on the poem, and when you're translating, you're already bringing different layers. You have to undress the words and make them as pure as she has them in her poems.
That's so interesting, undressing the words. I'll never forget that. Yeah, I think for me, it's translation. When you were reading your poems in Spanglish, I was thinking that this is what maybe, because I write fiction too, this is what sometimes working in fiction and poetry feels like. It's like the marriage and the divorce of two languages or two modes of writing. And I think translation, or my experience with translation, because I grew up in Bhopal speaking Hindi and English, and then acquired Italian when I started college and started working on Elena Ferrante. So that was like a sort of late acquisition, so there's a change in the way that I have started seeing Hindi and English after learning Italian, both of which were very natural languages to me, and then suddenly became denaturalized suddenly when the work of translation came in. And then when I started writing fiction, I think translation has really taught me what to withhold, as has poetry, like information that has to be withheld, or what must not be translated. So when I set poems now, or when I set my short stories now in Bhopal, I'm like, oh yeah, I could translate what this road or this street means, or what it looks like, but maybe I won't, because that is not translation. It's not a original. It's more. It feels more of a copy, or more contrived, or just feels a very violent imposition, which translation I think is sometimes wrongly accused of sometimes being. So I think that is what maybe translation has taught me as a poet and a writer in recent years.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you talk about withholding, because like I like you grew up in India, and I always, because my father moved around a lot in the country, so I think a lot of my growing up years were in places where my mother tongue was not the primary language, and so I feel like I just grew up always translating, and that's just a mode of being for me. And even now, at home we speak a mix of Hindi and English, so sometimes I don't even differentiate. I mean, I'm not conscious whether I'm speaking or thinking in Hindi or English. And I think I bring some of that into my poems, and I tend to use a lot of Indian words in my poems. And again, like you, I wonder, like, there are times when I think, okay, maybe I should be explaining certain phrases or words, but I feel like it adds to the music of the poems, and therefore does not really need to get translated. And so I think just the act of translation has helped me to just let it flow more organically in my poems, and and so I just I enjoy this mixing of languages.
I think of, Emily Dickinson was writing second half of the 19th century, and I often ask myself who her audience was in her mind. And it must have been herself, it must have been her circle, it must have been the people of Amherst, the people of New England. How different would Emily Dickinson's work be, or had been, had at any point, other than that very small number that was published anonymously in a newspaper in Springfield, had they been translated in her time for her to see her work in another language? Would that have changed her next poems? Would she have included words that come from other languages that we do today so easily, and almost like an obligation to say we are global people, we come from different parts of the world? She is so local and at the same time so universal in her language. It would have been fascinating to just see her eyes open up with the first translation of her work done into any language, French, Urdu, any Spanish.
Yeah, that is a beautiful thought, and certainly she did put lots of different languages in her poems, but it's another level. Dickinson considered poetry its own means of translation. Right. Beyond that, and by rearranging the vocabulary of her society, she could break free from social structure. So I pulled out a quote, which I love how you brought up music, that different languages add to the music of the poem. She wrote, "Better than music, for I who heard it. I was used to the birds before, this was different, 'twas translation. Of all tunes I knew, and more." Anything else you want to say about Emily Dickinson and what her poetry does for you, or has done for you in your writing careers?
Well, I first encountered Emily Dickinson's poems back in high school, and I think we were talking about it earlier. It was Success is Counted Sweetest by Those Who Never Succeed. And, you know, back then I wasn't even like reading too much poetry, but that poem made me sit up and pay attention. And yeah, and since then I guess I'm very inspired by her sort of quiet subversion of even like what it meant, what a poem means in her time, and not just her poetry, but her entire life and her way of being is a huge inspiration for me. Just like her being so prolific and without concern for being read or being famous, or well, perhaps it was a concern, but it didn't stop her from being so very prolific, and I just use that as an inspiration for my own daily writing.
Yeah, I think like Yamini, I also encountered Emily Dickinson in school. Hope is a Thing with Feathers, that was in our English textbook. And I think something about Emily Dickinson's poems since then, there was something very arresting about them. I think that they really, reading them as a teenager really taught me that poetry is about arresting attention. And I think I've since, seen her manuscripts at the Houghton Library and visited the Houghton Library just to look at everything, and was very excited and totally geeked out as an 18-year-old. My mom was also excited by me, even though she does not write poetry. And then I think very recently, a year or two ago, Elena Ferrante mentioned Emily Dickinson in her book In the Margins, and in a series of lectures that were written for Bologna. And I think there's something so exciting when Elena Ferrante, who's the writer of my life, was reading the poet of my life, Emily Dickinson, and reading through her and writing about her. And so that also made me geek out suddenly, and return to Dickinson with this new way of looking that Ferrante offered. And it was also very interesting because I read that essay first in Italian when it came out, and then in English, and was thinking about, did Ferrante read Dickinson in Italian or in English? Which one first? And how did that change the way that she's seeing Ferrante or reading Ferrante or reading Dickinson? So I think that was sort of a moment of revelation for me recently with my relationship to Emily Dickinson, renewed it or has activated it in a very different way, to have just that essay and to know, not that I ever doubted Ferrante has not read Emily Dickinson, but it was still very wonderful to have that perspective. It's hard to unwed it now from when I see or read about her.
I can't think of two more different writers
Yes.
than Elena Ferrante and Emily Dickinson, but I can't think of two that have so many more things in common also. The fact that Ferrante is a name for us and not a face is exceedingly refreshing. We don't have the tyranny of the image. We have the words, and that's what can drive us. And in Emily Dickinson's, because she comes from the time that she does, and because just the words Emily Dickinson, the name projects all this light, all this music. I find that the juxtaposition of who she was and what she does with words at an equal level. In response to your question, and I think to this day, though I spend so much time thinking, reading, teaching poetry, that poetry is at once the most unnatural of activities. Go out and there's a poem by Neruda that it takes place during the Spanish Civil War, the whole country is falling apart. Children are being killed on the streets, and he is sitting and writing a poem. And you think as a reader, why doesn't he go out, get a rifle, and start fighting back against? But it's the poem that will last, and the one that will speak to future generations. And that makes me think that there's nothing more natural than writing poetry. And I just think that Emily Dickinson is just the climax of all this. I love her. I came late to her. She was not in my textbooks. And for me, arriving as an immigrant to the United States and eventually to Amherst is arriving to Emily and to figuring out what you can do with incredible rhythms and sounds by using words as they are, and proving that there's ways to defy time and death by just sitting and writing a poem.
We do have an audience question with some compliments for Devanshi, loving the power of your lyric and poetry, especially as someone of Indian origin, acculturated in America. What struck immediately is the economy of images that expand, telescope, and compress back. I would so love to know more, and I think this is certainly something you all can address, about the role of architecture, spaces, and spatiality as motif that runs through so many of the poems read today. So maybe we could start with you, and then I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so I think I was actually this summer when I was at Juniper, I was working on the poems, or the ideas that I was working on do have to do with space. I was in Rome, and for the summer conference on the totalitarian and cultural heritage of totalitarianism in Italy, and we went to this place Mussolini had built called Eur, or EUR, on the outskirts of Rome, and structures he had built, and I was wondering what these structures mean and what their place in the cultural memory is, and thinking back to how things are developing in India now politically, and how spaces are being reconfigured, rebuilt, renamed. A lot of places in my city, Bhopal, have been renamed from Urdu to Hindi. And that changes the way you move around space. And so I think it also changes the kind of images that I have, or the kind of words that I want to turn back to. And because I think my Hindi was deeply influenced by Urdu. But then when you used an Urdu word, that would be like, oh, that's not Hindi, that's Urdu. And I'm like, well, actually, no, that's my Hindi. And it has that word. And so I think a lot of my images, or that are sort of developing in my mind, have to do more with the rupture and the shifts that have been caused in it recently. And I think also the images of space is also interesting, because my work on Ferrante sort of dealt with the city of Naples and the earthquake and how that changed space. And so there's, I think, that affect, which is sort of an atmosphere of emotions, and I think poetry is about that, sort of how atmospheric emotions can be. So I think I like to think of images as rooms to inhabit. And Yamini, you had a metaphor about a room, or the room inside a throat, that resonated so beautifully, and that I was thinking about as well. But yeah, that's what I've been working with in terms of images.
Yeah, thank you for that. Completely. I mean, I think space and places have like a really deep effect on me. I do feel like a lot of vibrations from place, and certainly a lot of my imagery hails from India, and yeah, I mean, and I think poetry is something that is always trying to capture the indefinable. So it's sort of strange to say that I feel a certain vibration, or like for that matter, I appreciate this reading so much. Sitting here in this space is just, yeah, it's hard to say how wonderful it is. But I do believe, especially old places, hold a lot of vibration and a lot of energy. And I think poetry is just is the way to capture those indefinable feelings. So a lot of my metaphors do come from mainly India, because that was so formative for me, but from the places I've visited and stayed in.
We were visiting, the three of us with the wonderful hosts, the different rooms of the house before the reading, and that helped us all, I think, get into the space. And we were led to see what is authentic and what was added over time, and how aspects have been renovated. And at one point, we saw a wall that opened up, and there was another wall behind with bricks. And that in and of itself was a beautiful metaphor for the poetry that I think we're all trying to build here, of getting deeper and seeing the wall behind the wall, and what is and is not in this sacred place.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful note to finish with. But do you have any questions for each other that you'd like to ask?
I have a question for both of you. I wonder if, when you read over time Emily Dickinson, you see different versions of yourself in previous readings, and if you're in dialogue with those previous versions of yourself.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think definitely, because I think there's a way in which at first, I don't know, Hope is a Thing with Feathers was the poem that I first read in school, and then that was sort of used as, I don't know, motivational poem of some sort. And then I read a totally different poem during that same period, which was My Life Had Stood a Loaded Gun, and that was such a different and violent image to me that it seemed incongruent somehow when I was 14, 15, encountering her works for the first time, about how this poet could generate poems that have two different emotional frequencies, in a sense. And then I think as you go through life, you obviously have a very different view of that. So now when I look at what I was reading and how, and also I think the poets that I was reading Emily Dickinson in conversation with were much more different than the poets that I'm reading now, that I'm reading in conversation with her, or the poets that I'm likening to her. So now when I think of Emily Dickinson, I also think of, We Were in Her Room, and I think of illness and death and the people she lost in her life. And when we were visiting the museum, I thought of her dog, and of her music, and of her alone with the page, her small writing desk.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are different things that come to mind now, and they also get attached sometimes to the poet as if you know them. And the work is not just the work anymore. It becomes a living document of that person and a life, and you realize that there was life behind those, which is exactly what sitting in this house feels like. So I think that's it's the poet and the poem sort of coming together.
I think reading poems over time, a lot of the meaning that you derive from it comes from your own life and your life experiences. So, that's how it is with Emily Dickinson's poems too. Because when, for instance, because I could not stop for death, when I read that when I was much younger, it almost sounded funny, or I found it humorous. And then, recently I lost my father, and all of those poems about death just read very differently to me now. And since I'm older, I'm more acutely aware of my own mortality as well. And so I read them very differently now. So I think a lot of the poems are like that. They're all of our interpretations are colored by our lives, right?
Right.
How would you answer that question?
Yes.
Your own question.
In two ways, I love what you were saying. I think that I think that the classics in poems by Emily Dickinson, being certainly in that category, are patient friends that wait for us and travel with us through life, and they change as we change. So when you go back to them, and they are the same poems but different poems, because you are no longer the same person who's reading them. And for some reason, I was thinking, while the two of you were speaking, that when Emily Dickinson wrote, there was no children's book publishing industry the way there is right now. There were some children's books, but very few, and children's books have become an explosive industry where Dr. Seuss and Eric Carle, all local to us around here, and we cater to having children read early on and give them vocabulary and inspiring them in different ways. And I think of like Hope is a Thing with Feathers or I Am Nobody as perfect pieces for a children's book. I think that she was writing ahead of her time in ways that would make the children look differently at images, at words, at what you can do with a poem. It's like prophetic, and it would have been wonderful to read her when I was a little child. I'm also happy that I didn't, because I had the freshness that came later. But I just feel eternal gratefulness to her for just being there, for being that pillar there. It's been a joy talking to both of you, really, and
Same.
terrific.
Likewise.
Thank you, Brooke.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you
I
so
think
much,
I'm
Ilan.
sure that you all have written some of those patient poems yourself that I hope will stay with our listeners and myself certainly, and yourself as you continue writing. So that concludes our Phosphorescence reading tonight, and I want to thank each of you, Yamini, Pathak, Devanshi, Khetarpal, Yamini, Pathak, and Ilan Stavans for being here and sharing your work with all of us. So thanks also to each of you tuning in from home, and we are just delighted that you could be with us tonight, and we look forward to being with you again for our September Phosphorescence reading, when we will be joined with Allison Adair, Kristen Hill, and Demisty Bellinger. And this next reading will also be a part of our biggest event of the year, which is the week-long Tell It Slant Poetry Festival, chock full of programs happening both online and on-site here at the Emily Dickinson Museum. So to register for that and other programs, and to learn more about the museum or make a donation, visit us at emilydickinsonmuseum.org. So thank you, poets, and thank you, audience. Good night.